over and under functioning shuts down any kind of curiosity or interests. I think in both parties, the person who's doing all the over functioning gets burnt out and gets resentful, right? And the person who's doing the under functioning isn't really interested in their part. If somebody's always going to kind of run the show and take care of things, if they can kind of interrupt that pattern, it just really opens up a lot of flexibility in the relationship.
Welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. I'm your host, Dan Purcell, a Christian marriage and intimacy expert and coach. I'm on a mission to help couples have the best sex and most emotionally intimate marriages possible. Our episodes cover topics you've always wondered about and are packed with practical advice designed to help you take your marriage to the next level. In many marriages, there are people that feel like they do far more than their share of the relationship work. But why do they tend to take on the responsibility of their spouse's share of the relationship, especially in stressful situations? You see, intimate marriages are like a system. Think of systems like an air conditioning and heating system in your home. It works hard to keep things at an even temperature or homeostasis. When the temperature gets too high, the air conditioning kicks on to cool things down. When the temperature gets too low, the heater kicks on to heat things up. So it's like a system. It's a way of keeping things normal and functioning in an environment where people can live. When there's stress and anxiety in a relationship, one person may tend to become overly responsible for the relationship to calm the other person down, to bring the relationship back into homeostasis. It's like the, I need you to calm down so that I can calm down idea. Meanwhile, the other person knows that their spouse tends to take over in situations like this, so they just sit back and they don't have to take full responsibility for themselves, letting their relationship skills atrophy and go undeveloped. This is called the overfunctioning, underfunctioning dynamic, and it shows up in sex too. If you've ever said to yourself, if I wasn't the person to always initiate sex here, nothing would ever happen, this could be a sign that you're an overfunctioner in your sexual relationship. I've been looking forward to sharing this interview with you for a very long time. Dr. Kathleen Smith, my guest today, is a world-renowned expert on systems theory and relationships. This is her second book and second time on my podcast. Her first appearance was episode number 45, if you want to look that up. She's the author of a new book, True to You, where she talks about the overfunctioning, underfunctioning dynamic in relationships and how to fix it. I read the book recently and loved it, so I invited her onto the show to talk about it. In October, we're hosting our next in-person marriage retreat. This is ideal for couples that are in otherwise happy marriages but wish things were better in the intimacy department. Our retreats are absolutely not boring and nothing like being in a stuffy conference room at some hotel. This is a vacation, a getaway for you and your spouse where you get to work with me and do a deep dive into your marriage relationship. It's also romantic. Our retreats are also squeaky clean. There's no nudity, no demonstrations, and no one is asked to work through their issues in front of the group either. And it's because it's set up this way. It's a place where you can actually talk about the important aspects of your marriage and make real progress in your relationship in this weekend. But you don't have to take my word for it. I invite you to check out the many interviews of past retreat attendees on my website describing what their experience at the retreat was like. Thank you for your podcast reviews. Someone recently shared this on Apple Podcasts. This podcast is amazing. It discusses a wide variety of issues that married couples experience in a respectful, fun, and informative way. I have enjoyed hearing from a lot of sex and intimacy experts here, and I've learned a lot from it. Get Your Marriage On is my favorite marriage podcast. If you'll please take a moment to leave a review too, and if you hear your review read in a future episode, email support@getyourmarriageon.com and I will mail you a gift. Dr. Kathleen Smith, welcome to the Get Your Marriage On podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. Good to be here.
Great to have you back. You're one of my earlier guests on my podcast, and I love your work. You've come out with this new book called True to You, which I absolutely totally love, and I hope all of our listeners get a copy, because it's fantastic. It's a great book on relationships. But before we get into your message of the book and what I'm learning from you, I first want to know, has there been a time when your husband went out of town and you learned something about yourself?
Yes, recently. I am fascinated by how my functioning changes when you take my husband out of the room. And very predictably, I
Uh-huh.
realized that I was staying up late, looking at like Instagram reels. I was ordering
Uh-huh.
food that was not necessarily the healthiest. I couldn't seem to get the energy to do very simple tasks like take out the trash. I mean, I did it, but I acted like I should have gotten a medal for doing it, right? Because he normally does that, right? And it was
Uh-huh.
fascinating to see just how my functioning really dipped because not because he reminds me to do any of these things. He doesn't tell me what to eat or when to go to bed. It's just having that significant adult in the room makes you kind of function up a little bit, right? Because maybe
Uh-huh.
you know what you're supposed to be doing and how to take care of yourself. And when you can get away with not doing it, it's very easy to do. So,
Right, right.
I tried not to be too hard on myself about it, but it's just really interesting to see how in our marriages we are propped up a little bit by the other person. And that's not a good or a bad thing. It's a very natural thing, but it's also really good to be able to be responsible for yourself when you're solo, right? And so that's something that was kind of a sign to me that, oh, I need to start working on this a little bit better. So the pressure's not on all on him. Yeah.
That's fun. So, what do you mean by functioning? Someone listening to this may not know what you mean by my
Yeah,
functioning.
functioning is just how you're operating. Can you get up and get these tasks done? Can you take care of yourself? Can you calm yourself down, right? Can you relate to other people, right? Those are all aspects of functioning, not just asking somebody, how are you feeling, right? How are you functioning?
Right.
What have you been able to make happen and not make happen? And that's so useful to pay attention to in the context of a marriage.
It reminds me of one of my teenage daughters. She's very melodramatic. And when, she's having a problem in her relationships, her functioning goes way, way, way down. We can't count on her to do her part in our family or anything like that. Like, I guess that's like an example, right? Are you functioning? Are you able to do your tasks
Right.
that need to get
Right,
done?
because
Yeah.
there's not always as much we can do about our feelings, but it's about how are you functioning? Even when the stress is up at home or at work or elsewhere,
Uh-huh.
how do you want to be functioning? I think that's the real thing you can tinker with, not so much the feelings piece.
Makes sense. Makes sense. All right. In the marriage, does one person tend to function more than the other sometimes?
Yeah, you can get a kind of seesaw effect. I think it has a lot to do with our positions in our own families growing up, right? Were you the responsible oldest who was kind of directing everyone and helping take care of them? Were you a younger sibling who's just kind of along for the ride? And people could tell
Uh-huh.
you if you needed to do something or they would do it for you, right? It has a lot to do with that. And so we often will marry people who are kind of a comfortable fit with that position we were in our family. So often you will see youngest and oldest marrying, not necessarily, but it happens a lot of the time.
Uh-huh.
Um, and we settle into these comfortable roles where one person tends to be over responsible for the other person who kind of goes along with it. Or the other person will kind of what's called underfunctioning and invites the help from the other person. It can sort of happen in either direction, right? And that's comfortable to a degree until you face a real challenge or the stress goes up, right? It's easy to kind of settle into that dynamic of one person sort of being more directing, being in the theory I use what's called being sort of irresponsibly over involved with what the other person is doing and how they live their life. But that doesn't mean that it can't shift back and forth. There are many ways I might try and overfunction for my husband. And then there are ways where I might, like the example I gave, act less capable and invite his overfunctioning. So it can go back and forth, but sometimes it is sort of more of a fixed kind of seesaw that you'll see in a marriage.
Gotcha. So you're a marriage and family therapist. You work with individuals and couples and families, help them in their dynamics and their relationships. Can you tell me any stories of someone that you've worked with where you saw them over functioning, let's
Sure.
say, and why were they over functioning? And tell us that
Yeah, well,
story.
actually, I'm a counselor, but I do family work, so it's I
Oh,
yeah, that's
counselor.
okay.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, so it's I'll just, before I tell a specific story, I'll just add a note of how obvious this is sometimes when people meet with me, even if it's virtually. Let's say I'm working with a couple and they're both in different rooms on Zoom, and one person can't get themselves unmuted, or there's like, you automatically see the other person start to problem solve for them, where and it just like from the jump, right? And I'm sitting there thinking, you know what? I think they can probably figure out how to unmute themselves, right? But it's just so automatic for the other person to start to direct. And I don't put any judgment on that. It's just a useful observation. And so I think often people don't realize how quick they are to function for the other person. And they have it's not bad natured. It just is, it's just one way we keep things calm in a family or in a marriage. And so I can think of one example in particular, and I use this example in the book, the story that I tell. And obviously the stories in the book are sort of combinations of people, and I change the details. So it's, I like to protect people's confidentiality. But, I had somebody come in who really was focused on their spouse's functioning, in particular, a woman who's really focused on getting her husband to do various chores, right? And, maybe it was like mowing the yard or taking out the trash or fixing the sink. I can't remember the example I use in the book. And she noticed that she had given her husband a lot of direction. She had given him suggestions about how to remember to do this. She was leaving little Post-it notes on his steering wheel of his car, And lo and behold, did this make him function up or more capable? It did not, right? So often we invite the very opposite of what we want through our behavior, right? And this woman in particular began to learn about overfunctioning, but she was of the mindset that she wanted to step back to make him behave better. Oh, if I stop reminding him, if I stop bringing this up at all, he's going to start doing these things, right? And you think that might happen. Maybe it does sometimes. But the focus is still on him and what he's doing, right? It's, if I push this button, will I get this result? And there's still a very anxious focus, right? Let's say like your spouse leaves clothes in a pile on the floor, right? And you always pick it up. And then one day you decide that you're not going to pick it up, but you're sitting there watching, going, okay, he's going to do this, right? That's still an anxious focus, right? And it's not about you. It's about trying to change them. So I think what people often find is that a shift out of overfunctioning is not about trying to change the other person. It's about recognizing that, first of all, your efforts to help are not very helpful. And then also you have to think about where you put your energy in the relationship. And sometimes people will rise to the occasion and sometimes they won't. And then you have to think about what you want to do. But so often we're just trying to change others in different ways. And maybe that looks like doing a lot for somebody or telling them how to live their life. Or maybe it looks like sort of anxiously monitoring them. But that's still kind of a way of overfunctioning because the focus is not on you and where you want to put your energy and how you want to manage yourself. So I think in this particular example that I gave with this woman, it wasn't about, let me stop doing all the chores and anxiously monitoring if my husband can be responsible. It was more about, where do I want to put my energy and what's really important and what's not, and is this the thing I want to focus on, or are there other things? And often maybe it was sort of learning to live with the yard being the grass being a little bit higher sometimes, and that was manageable,
Why do we overfunction? Like from the outside, it looks like you're the hero. You're the nice person. You're the committed person. You're the involved person. You're the dedicated person.
Yeah, it's an attempt to kind of manage tension, right? Or the lack of separateness between people, right? We so often we function as if the other person is an extension of ourselves. So they should do what we do. Right. They should dress how we think they should dress. They should be interested in the things we're interested in. They should communicate how we want them to communicate, right? There's not a respect for the individuality of the other person. And I think that generates tension when people are different and they have different ways of doing things. And then how do you manage yourself in the face of the fact that your spouse is another separate person who is in charge of
Mhm.
themselves. That can be deeply uncomfortable, if they walk out the door wearing some ridiculous outfit, right? To let them go out into the world as themselves.
I did a reel about this on my Instagram, and the husband is trying to make cookies, bake cookies, and he's following the instructions, and it says to grease the bottom of the pan. So he picks up the cookie sheet and he turns it upside down and is doing the spray on the underside of the pan right when the wife walks in. She's like, "What are you doing?" It's like, "It says to spray the bottom of the pan." She's like, "It's not like you're supposed to spray like where the cookies
Yeah,
will go." And he's purposely
mm,
underfunctioning because he knows that if he can get caught doing something dumb or stupid, his wife will step in, and guess what she'll do? She'll make the cookies
sure.
for him, and all he can just go back to go back to the TV and watch the game,
Yeah,
right? But the reason why she steps in that moment is she can't handle that he's doing it wrong. It causes her so much
yeah,
anxiety. Like she would rather just stop whatever she was doing and bake the cookies for
sure.
him instead of really help him address his own, like, it's a manipulation kind of in
Right.
there too. But
Well, what I think is interesting is that as parents, people recognize this. Like when a kid is sort of pretending they can't tie their shoes or
oh
and
yeah,
and they know that they have to manage their distress while their children learn to do things, right? But we are not as good at remembering this with grown-ups and adults.
right.
I think often a parent can say, "I'm going to let my kid fumble through this because it's useful for them." Very rarely do we say that with a spouse or maybe somebody at work, because we forget that it's useful for the pan to mess up or the cookies to stick to the sheet, and then that they can problem solve based on that data.
Yeah, yeah. Uh-huh. Right, right.
That's how learning happens.
Yeah, that's right. All right, so the counterbalance to all this is underfunctioning. Why do we tend to underfunction in our relationships?
I think because it's comfortable. That goes back to the piece I said about sort of our families of origin, right? Because there are people who are
Mhm.
willing to direct us or take over or over involve themselves. And so it can happen with somebody sort of inviting that out of you or you inviting that out of them. It can happen kind of in either direction. Or because functioning better is threatening, right? Saying what you actually think, being responsible for something. I'm thinking about, at home or at work or elsewhere. That's inherently risky because you might get it wrong or somebody might disagree with you, right? And so it's easier to just kind of coast and not do your part for fear that you'll fail or people won't be happy about it. So I think for a lot of folks, it becomes a very comfortable position, but at a great cost because the relationship doesn't get your skills your capabilities, and B, people are putting a lot of energy into you, and there's not going to be much energy for them for themselves.
Yeah. And you miss out on your own growth because you let other people handle things
Yeah.
for you. I think about a woman I've coached, and you alluded to a similar scenario in your book too. She's the youngest child in her family, and her parents died when she was in her teens. So the older siblings kind of passed her around and raised her, and really felt really bad for her. So they did a lot. They did a lot to take care of her, and she married a very responsible man who kind of fit the mold of that, older sibling that just took care of everything for her. Fast forward years, now they're empty nesters. They're realizing they don't have a great sex life because he's always taken care of everything sexually in their relationship. She really hasn't had to put forth a lot of effort to even figure out what her sexual desires are or her own preferences and everything like that because her husband always took care of those things. And now it was time to address those things. And that's when they came in for coaching. But it can be subtle. Maybe on the outside, it looks like you're being so nice by doing all the things and helping out or for this person because of the circumstances. But we tend to, I think, rush in too
Sure.
quick to helplessness.
Yeah, I think one thing I observe in working with folks is how, and this relates to sex and intimacy as well, like how over and under functioning shuts down any kind of curiosity or interests. I think in both parties, the person who's doing all the over functioning gets burnt out and gets resentful, right? And the person who's doing the under functioning isn't really interested in their part. If somebody's always going to kind of run the show and take care of things, why be interested if somebody else is just kind of handling everything? And so I think what people often find is if they can kind of interrupt that pattern, that both people have a greater capacity to be curious, about what's fun, what's interesting, what pleases them and their partner. It just really opens up a lot of flexibility in the relationship that you don't have when you're stuck in that kind of seesaw. And what I really appreciate is it doesn't really matter which person starts to act differently. It can be the overfunctioner or it can be the underfunctioner, and it makes a difference in the relationship. But often it is easier for the overfunctioner to start to do something differently because the underfunctioner doesn't have a lot of incentive to step up, right? Like, why would you?
Not always. Right. Hey.
So anybody can change. It does. I'm just always interested in whoever wants to volunteer, but often people are focused on the other person needing to be the volunteer.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. I want to dive in a little bit deeper in sexual overfunctioning and underfunctioning. Can you give me a few more examples what it might look like? Like, how do you know, like, for example, the person comes in, I'm the higher desire for sex in my relationship. I desire it more. But what are the telltale signs that they're also over-functioning in their sexual relationship in an unhealthy way?
Yes, I think they have a very specific definition of what things getting better looks like. And I think they also have, I see a lot of assigning homework to the other partner. Like, we both have to read this book for things to get better,
AKA, you need to read this book.
I've already read it, and now you need to read it, or I'm going to read it out loud to you, and you're going to pay attention, right, about how we can have a better sex life, right? Like, you see that. And I think...
I'm so guilty of all of these things, by the way.
But I think what people forget is that there are multiple paths to things getting better, and that people can do something together, but also as individuals. When a person can say to their partner, I think it would be awesome if we were both curious about this part of our lives. How do you want to go about doing that? So that means maybe they read a different book, right? Or they listen to this podcast, or they sit down and think about how they, want to be more responsive to their partner, right? Like, there are so many things they can do. And that doesn't mean that a person will step up. But I think that it creates a greater possibility because there's not that pressure on them to function a certain way. When you can say to somebody, this is important to me, but I'm going to let you be in charge of how you step up. I think often people will, it can just kind of breathe a sigh of relief on both ends because the overfunctioner is like, okay, now I don't have to assign all this reading to my wife or to my husband and check in on them, right?
Right.
That's kind of a downer, and the other person can start to take responsibility for themselves in a way that they haven't before. So that's often a question I will have for couples, in particular when it comes to sex. Like, how do you want to be responsible for getting more curious about this? What does that look like to you? How do you not get too focused on managing how the other person navigates it? Because that is often what will happen. And, if somebody is putting that kind of pressure on you to function in a certain way and to get better in a certain way, the front part of your brain is not involved in that,
Yeah. I like how you're saying it's about managing the other person in it. And I think overfunctioning and underfunctioning can manifest itself in patterns of how couples initiate sex. So I talk to a lot of individuals who I can see are overfunctioners, where they are sick and tired of always being the one to initiate sex. They wish it was a little more balanced so the other person showed more interest. So they try to interrupt the pattern by stop initiating, hoping that their spouse, the underfunctioning spouse, will step up and fill the void. And it doesn't. How come?
That's really interesting, and that's a common thing that happens with folks. Yeah, I think I'm thinking about two things. Is there too much of a focus on keeping score? Because I think there is this question of, it's useful for your partner to know what you're thinking and what you want, and to not have to read your mind and guess. So what is your own part in getting your needs met? That doesn't mean you have to speak up every time, but often I think when there's anxiety in the relationship, we shift into this kind of keeping score. And often, like just the example I gave before about the woman whose husband, wouldn't mow the yard. Even if you're waiting for the other person to step up, they can sense when you have an anxious focus on them, right? And that
Yes.
and that can really shut down a person's sort of move towards being responsible, right? And so to think about sort of how do you manage yourself while a person kind of fumbles their way towards being a more responsible part? So if the other person does initiate, or if they don't do it exactly the way you want to, how do you not shut that down or criticize? How do you kind of just have fun with it and be a little bit more lighthearted, right? Can you make a joke? Can you not everything calls for a joke, but like I think when people can be a little bit more flexible, it really kind of opens up the possibility for things not having to play out this very particular way that we think they have to, right? Being able to kind of ask your spouse, like, okay, what ideas do you have? What could be like a fun way that you could initiate, like, let's see what we can do with this. And maybe it's terrible and it doesn't work at all, just kind of going into it with that like researcher mindset, which I realize doesn't sound very sexy, but like, I think it makes a big difference to be able to say, well, that didn't work. What do we want to do now? Like it just puts less pressure on people needing to operate a certain way. So I think that lightheartedness, that openness to things getting solved in a different way than you had imagined really does so much.
Gotcha. You say this line over and over in your book that I love. It's about not being responsible for your spouse, it's being responsible to your spouse. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more in this context?
Yeah, being responsible to somebody is thinking about how you want to show up and be present and be sort of a thoughtful, responsible human in relationship to them. Because we're really, when you think about how do I want to be responsible to my spouse, that could look like, this is how I share my thinking or my needs. This is how I listen to them and be thoughtful and respectful. Maybe being responsible to them is when they're anxious, I sit there and listen instead of fixing the problem for them, right? That's a different way of functioning where you're connected to them, but you're not treating them like, they're a part of you, that they're a separate person in some ways. And often the ways that we try and be responsible for people isn't really that's helpful. It's that what in Bowen theory is called, as I said before, being irresponsibly over-involved. It's not really a type of responsibility at all.
Any tips on how to metabolize the anxiety in relationships instead of being so reactive to them? Somehow to process them better? Because that's the life work, right?
Yeah. I mean, people get so fixated on there being one specific thing they need to do, whether it's this breathing exercise is going to solve all my problems, but it's just kind of coming to your own practice of what it means to take care of yourself in the long term, right? Like, what are the practices that help you manage anxiety better, and how you take care of yourself and your body and your mind. But there's also what you're doing in the moment when you feel anxiety in the relationship or in the other person. Recognizing if you're not paying attention, what do you do? And then asking yourself, what do I want to do instead? So like the classic example, I think, is always like if your spouse walks in the door and they're distressed about something. If you're not paying attention, what do you do? Do you try and fix their problem? Do you assume it's something that you did? And then that triggers a fight between the two of you, like, what do you run away and don't want to feel their anxiety? Or can you just be present and be a little bit calmer than they are as they work to manage their own distress? And how useful that is, when the other person is doing that. And you get that practice every day. So there's no particular fix. It's just recognizing in the moment and saying, what do I want to do with myself? Do I want to take a deep breath? Do I want to ask a good question instead of giving an answer? I mean, there's a million things you can do.
That's good. We've talked a lot about a sexual overfunctioner, how they're really fixated on their spouse and they kind of have one way of thinking of how things should improve here, instead of broader question of how are each of us going to be responsible for our sexual relationship. What about underfunctioners? What about them? How do they get out of their sexual underfunctioning on themselves?
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is, what do you do when somebody tries to make a project out of you? Do you go
Yeah.
along with it and try and keep them happy? Do you run away and avoid it? Or do you fight back and attack them and criticize them, right? So what's an option that's none of those things? That's being able to kind of ask yourself, how do I want to represent myself? And that applies to sex as well. How do I show up? What do I think I need to get curious about? What are my own measures for this in this arena of life? Like, how do I tell if things are going well or not? What does my functioning look like if they are? Like, you can have your own definition of that, but I think often what people do is their definition is my spouse happy with me or not? That their feelings become the metric, right? Versus, like, if you were giving yourself your own little self-evaluation, like, what would you look for? What would be the signs? What are your own beliefs about the role of sex or intimacy in a marriage? Most people have not sat down and written those out. That can be it doesn't sound very fun, but that's a really useful practice that I think helps people get clearer with themselves about what they're trying to do and who they're trying to be, and who they want to be for their partner, their spouse, right? So I think often people think that they have to be interested or curious first for this to happen, but I think you just need some good questions, and then the curiosity can kind of follow, because you're starting to think about your own part and there's less focus on the other person. But I think often what I have found, if I'm like going back to the cookie sheet, like if I see my husband loading dishwasher a way I wouldn't, or like I'm weird about like knives, if he's using a giant knife to cut something that I think a small knife, and I'm, and I'm like, what are you doing? Use this instead. He is very good because he can say, Kathleen, I am in charge of myself. I will let you know if I need some assistance. And so I think when the underfunctioner can say, let me see what I can do with this. I have this theory that if I start to get more interested in my part in our sex life, I think it's going to make a difference. Can you just
back off?
Can you wait and see if that does? Because I really think that it will, and I don't think it's fair to you to always have to have the solutions. Often the overfunctioner will not like that. They will push back because they have lots of good ideas. But I think if you can kind of hang in there and be calm and say, let's play around. Let's see. Let me see what I can do. You have no idea how high I can fly, right? Like just being able to kind of, like I said, be lighthearted about it. I think it often makes a difference. And it's not your job to teach the other person to stop overfunctioning, because that is its own form of overfunctioning, right? It's just to remind them that you're a person who can solve problems, and do better for yourself. And hopefully they'll listen to you.
Great. As we conclude this, there's something I learned from you, and that is to think more about the process by which we make our decisions. Like the how we arrive to our decisions is far more important than the why or the what of the decisions were. Anything, a story you can share that will kind of sum up our conversation about the importance of really thinking about the process in which we think about why we do things in relationships?
Yeah, I'm thinking about this example I gave earlier of the woman who was really trying to teach her husband how to do better around the house, and the why was, why won't he function better? You know, why won't he
Yes.
do the things I ask? Doesn't he care about me? You know, that's the logical conclusion to the why questions, right? It's either your fault or
He doesn't care.
it's a why, you know, it's either your fault or somebody else's. Blame is the only answer to the why question, right? But the how question is, how do we get caught up in this pattern of me directing him and he either going along with it or fighting back or acting more helpless, right? Because that's sort of what would happen. He would sort of go along with it for a while, and then his functioning would dip down again, right? And they could kind of look at, you know, their parents, right, and the previous generations and say, this is the way that things have kind of shaken out in our families, that we gain some stability when some people are kind of calling the shots. And that's very comfortable for us. And so it makes a lot of sense that our marriage would kind of play out that way. And it's not good or bad, it's just very limiting, you know? So she could equally see her part and how it was very comfortable for her as well. You know, she was oldest sister. She watched her mom, you know, really manage a lot for her father. And she would go, it makes total sense, you know, that I would marry somebody who would fall into that dynamic as well. But are we limited to that? You know, can we sort of evolve into a different way of relating to each other? And how useful that will be, not just for us, but for our kids as well, to see that, you know, for the next generation to maybe do a little bit better. And that there are different ways of relating to each other than the seesaw. But that it will stir up some discomfort to not operate that way. And that's not a sign that something is wrong. That's a sign that we're growing and doing something differently. So are we willing to tolerate the discomfort it takes for one of us to step up and the other one of us to step back, you know? And that came out of that how thinking, not the blaming thinking.
That's good. Great. Kathleen, thank you very much. Thanks for sharing your wisdom. Where can people go to learn more about you, your work, and your books?
Yeah, so they can go to my website, which is KathleenSmithWrites.com. And I also write a Substack where I talk about all this stuff called The Anxious Overachiever.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Dan.
Thank you for watching this video. Don't forget to subscribe, like, or even comment below, and go see what other wonderful videos we have that will help you strengthen your marriage intimately.